I had to let the music play a little bit, Thomas, because last time I was told that I abruptly cut it off. So we're getting better, everybody. Welcome to episode 47 of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm one of the VPs at Sumer Sports. I'm joined by the CEO of Sumer Sports, Thomas Dimitrov. Thomas, you're at the office right now. NFL Network behind you. You almost have a dip in, frankly. Like we're ready. Look, I watch film on all these guys too. Sometimes I don't know what I'm looking for, but off air I kind of threw you some nuggets about these players, and they seem to stick. So I think like we're in a really good spot here to talk about defensive linemen.
No, hey, I will tell you, so happy to be back here. Look, I have no falling lamps in the background. The other day, man, I was agitated. I didn't sleep well. I woke up this morning ready to go. 4 a.m, eyes wide open, thinking, we're going to take this head on, like some of these DNs we're going to be talking about. I can't wait to talk about them. I love talking DNs. It's not an easy place. Everyone thinks, oh, it's easy. Just grab a guy and get upfield, get to your quarterback. And there are a lot of mistakes. You didn't bring this stat to the table. I wish I would have. There are a lot of mistakes with the defensive end position. Everyone thinks it's quarterback, and this, it is very prevalent. You got to keep your eye on these DNs. This is a big thing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because an analytics guy like me will say that defensive end, edge, is a more or less solid position from an analytical perspective. Can the guy get up? Can the guy get pressure in college? Is he athletic? If he checks both boxes, he's going to go high in the draft. And if he doesn't check one box or the other, then it's up to scheme, right? Like we've seen guys like Elvis Dumervil be shorter guys who don't necessarily have that to them. We've seen athletic guys like Tano Passingo who weren't all that productive at places like Villanova and stuff like that, where or Danielle Hunter's the key one, right? Danielle Hunter, not a ton of production at LSU, but a physical freak. You get him with, the coaching staff in Minnesota and he can be productive. And I think that's where the issue is, right? It's like and you were a coach, you guys barely ever picked high, right? And so, you were always in a position with New England as well as Atlanta where you're never going to take a Chase Young. You're never going to take any of the Bosa's. So your hit rate is going to be harder because you're the pick of the litter is already gone.
Yeah, I think we went round and round about it. We always incessantly talk about Vic Beasley. I get it. It's always on my mind. Will forever be on my mind. But there have been a lot of other ones that we've nipped at different organizations that have been around. You think you have them. Again, I can't stress enough. You stress so much the need for a DN, and there's just a lot of mistakes because you think, wow, this guy's really athletic. This guy looks great. This guy's just an Adonis. We start talking about Lukas Van Ness when we get there. Guys that look really good, but they have some limitations to them. Sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't. So it's going to be really interesting. Let me just say, by the way, does everyone realize how fortunate they are to be around a guy like you that's just going to pull out, Villanova players that we all know maybe deep down? And when I remember working him out, but I mean, you're just pulling it out of your ears, man. I love it. I just love where you're going.
Yeah, I mean, it's for those you always talk about, rising executives, and I think that's great because you had the football life that I think was, maybe not typical, but but if you're somebody on my side of the counter analytically, like you have to, like, I remember when the Chiefs drafted Tano Passingo, and I'm like you sort of, and being a sports bettor before I joined Sumer, like you live and sweat through your wins and losses, right? When you like a player and he's like, that's why we talk about Baker Mayfield, right? Like, because you put a stake in the ground, you say, I kind of like him, and then he's not very good. And you're like, okay, do I learn from this? Do I pretend it didn't happen? Like, and obviously this pales in comparison to what it's like as a general manager, because you're literally staking your career on some of these guys. But with analytics guys, I do it for the whole draft versus you guys doing it for 10 picks a year. And so you remember that stuff. And so, I'm just saying that, the rising analytics people, make predictions, because predictions are always, and this is in the educational research as well. If you ask students to make predictions, they learn better, right? If you have skin in the game, you learn better. Nothing sharpens your mind like risk. And risk, is about, whether you're betting or whether you're, risking your reputation and things like that. It's an incredibly important notion that I've learned over, and it means I can like remember this stuff because I remember sweating it out when it happened.
Well, look, great point. When we were talking to your group at Ohio State the other day, we made some good discussion points there. I believe the idea of a rising young data scientist that wants to get his foot in the door and impress upon the people on the football side, which is not easy to do. It's in the delivery, it's in the leading amongst your group, of course, it's in articulating, communicating. We can go on and on with that. But it is also having an idea and an understanding of the game. It's having a historical perspective, not in a sort of contrived way, but in a real interest way. You want to win a coach over as a data person or a long-standing personnel man. Start talking about some of the guys that Eric's talking about here, because it is a really important thing. You gain credibility as you're able to continue to communicate with these people versus just coming in and knowing the last 2 years, right? Then that shows your age, unfortunately, and then people start thinking, well, this person doesn't have a real understanding of ball. I want to start with that, but I also want to lead in, Eric, because before we get to the defensive ends and the defensive linemen, I think it's important when we start talking about some of these DNs and we start talking about the interior people, right? When we write up players as, scouts or personnel men or former general managers or whatever, when we're writing up players, we need to be very specific about what they are and what the projection is going to be. Meaning, is this guy an outside guy? Is he a 3-4 DN? Is he a 4-3 DN? Inside, what is his deal? Is he a first and second down guy? Is he a 1, 2, and 3 down guy? Understand, whenever we're writing up the D line, it is really important that we differentiate so that when you're giving these reports over to your coaches or to your personnel people, that there's a good understanding that you understand what they are and how they fit into the system.
100%. And that's why it's so important to have a decent understanding of the history of the league as well, because, look, if I'm going to you and I'm saying, hey, I really like, there was the Chiefs signed a guy named Charles Omenihu the other day, and I was watching him a little bit, and I'm like, kind of reminds me of Michael Bennett of the Seahawks. And, I have a weaponry where I can go back and look and say, oh my God, like the statistical profile of Michael Bennett looks similar. Like both guys ran a 4.9 or slower. Both guys were later round picks. Both guys were not productive early. Both guys are inside outside. And it's like, you like, if I'm like, let's say you're the decision maker and I'm coming to you, I'm like, you should sign him. And you're like, well, tell me why. And I'm like, I could tell you all the stats in the world, but I think the easiest way to convey it would be to be like, well, remember that time when the Seahawks signed Michael Bennett and then the Legion of Boom was amazing because he could play outside on early downs and inside on late downs. And he was a menace. And like here, there's similar statistical profiles. Then you're like, oh, because, there's a, the movie Road Trip where, one of the characters is like, I could teach you anything as long as I can relate the material. If you can relate the material to somebody else's experience, to me, that's a very humane way of promoting analytics, promoting what you're trying to do. And to your point, like you have to have prototypes in your mind. Is this guy an outside guy? What do I think about when I think about an outside guy? And if you come at it from a stats perspective, build that statistical prototype. If you're a scout, build that scouting prototype and then be able to relate, because look, like I think the most humane thing that somebody can do when they're trying to break into a discipline, or where they're trying to win the hearts and souls of people who are, in the discipline for a long time, is to talk about their experiences, right? Because that's where they have an edge over you, right? Like you've made more decisions than I'll probably ever make about football, and it's like, well, in order for us to communicate, like that's probably the easiest medium, right?
It is, and you're making some great points here. We've also talked, Eric, the idea about making sure that those comparatives aren't just statistical, right? Just, again, up and coming guys and gals that are getting into the NFL and earning the sort of credibility and the respect from the people in the building. When you're compare apples to apples, like physically important, right? You're not just saying this guy reminds me of so-and-so and you have a 5'9" guy and a 6'2" guy.
Right.
It just doesn't fly, right? It literally, they have to be in the physical physically have to be in the same mode. Same with explosiveness. You're not going to, compare a guy who's a long, loping, levered guy with a guy who's a short, quick twitch guy, but maybe there's something that reminds you of him. You can use that in your comparatives, of course, but it's very tough to group them in and saying, this guy really reminds me of this player, and it may be only one thing. So I would always say be careful in that transition. And as you're moving into the NFL, it's so important to make sure that everything comparative-wise are kind of in line. And let me ask you this before. Here I am. You're the host. I'm just along for the ride, but I'm fascinated by this. I'm going to ask you, I'm going to put you on the spot like you do me. Who, in your mind, over the last 10 years, I think 10, no, I'll give you 12 years or 15 years. 15 years. Who is your biggest bust at the pass rush position? Let's just say that. Let's keep it out of the interior.
So the player that I thought would be good that hasn't been good.
Or something happened that you were expecting to rip it up and maybe had the talent to, but didn't. Besides Vic Beasley.
I mean, this one's easy because of injuries, but also he hasn't been effective. Chase Young was like one of the best, guys, sort of in my algorithm for a long time. Like that was always somebody who I thought was better than that was always somebody who to me was worthy of the second pick and in, a sort of game changer type player. I think that, my evaluation of him was written up even somewhere. And that one was one where I thought, he would be amazing. And so far, it hasn't really been the case. When it comes to like defensive tackle, the one that I actually, frankly, like, I think he's grown on me a little bit is Derek Brown. Like, I didn't think Derek Brown could be a pass rusher. I thought he would be an amazing run stuffer, and he's been that, but he's been a good enough pass rusher to be worthy, I wouldn't say worthy of a top 10 pick, like he was 8th, but I think he's worthy of a top 15 pick so far. And that was one where there's even an article on PF. Like, that's what I love about this is like, I write this up and I say, look, he's not worthy of a first round pick because he can only stop the run, and he does a better job as a pass rusher than I predicted him to be. And so he's probably a second contract guy and probably a big second contract guy for the Panthers. And that was one that I whiffed on because I didn't think he had enough juice, and we'll see if I'm right or wrong, but like that was one where and the one that I'm really sort of thinking about, Trayvon Walker. I did not think that Trayvon Walker had the production profile to be the number 1 overall pick, and I think he was good enough last year so far. We'll see if he emerges, but that was one again where I kind of didn't understand that pick, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Which is a perfect segue into my player that I would mention, because I think he is a fantastic athlete. I still think he is, even though he just got arrested and put in jail for another year. I don't know if he went to the University of Missouri.
Aldon Smith?
Exactly. I mean, when Aldon Smith came out, obviously he ripped it up. He was doing unbelievable things for Trent Baalke. That was a tough thing for Trent, right? Because things were going down the way they did, of course, as far as, when they had to pick him. There were so many things about Aldon Smith that were really, really positive, really positive. Here's the quandary, and here's a debate topic for sure. I've always thought all of us, anyone who works in the NFL or anyone outside, need to understand what the owner of the team is expecting when you pick someone like Aldon Smith, right? For instance, is he a hit or is he a miss? And how are you gauging that? I wish that I could have gone back to Arthur Blank and said, in any of these picks, before we pick them, just let me know so I'm on, and it's not hindsight, or it's not revisionist history. And I would say, okay, Aldon Smith comes in, very, very similar to Vic Beasley, in 2 years, unbelievable amount of sacks, and then just plummets. If he plummets because of character, or if he plummets because of work ethic or lack of passion regarding, Vic, that wasn't the case with Aldon. His were have to do with other character situations, but he's no longer with your team, even though he's led the league in sacks. If he didn't move into the next wave and sign the next contracts, is he truly a hit? or is he a bust? And this is something that is tough because if someone gets you to the Super Bowl, maybe don't win, but gets you to the Super Bowl, is that a hit forever and ever? Amen. Even if he fizzles down the rest of the way. And so these are tough things that GMs and staffs often ask, right? Where are we going with this? How do we gauge this?
And I think, like, in some decision making, and I know you did a great job on the Wharton Moneyball pod with Cade Massey, and one of the things that he does, and all those guys in the decision space, like Richard Thaler and all the all those great thinkers there, they talk about what are called pre-mortems, right? So, like, and I know, you go through that with your owner, like, hey, what if this guy's a complete shitbird and he doesn't make it here? But, like, what about the intermediate stuff? Like, and we did some pre-mortem analysis at PFF with the pandemic. Like, okay, what happens if only the Big Ten plays, or what happened? And we're like, okay, what's our money situation going to be like if that happens? But do you think, and maybe, this is not this is something we probably should do at Zoomer, but, like, go to a team and say, let's talk about this pick from a like we talk, because I talk about Mayfield that way. Like, how do you define success? If Mayfield gets us out of the miry clay and gets us into a situation where we know that we are a Deshaun Watson type QB away from being really good, that's positive. But does that count as a success? Jared Goff, if you get the Rams out of being bad, right? I mean, Fisher Rams, before then it was like the Hazlitt and those Rams. Goff got them to a place where Goff became the problem. Same with Alex Smith. Alex Smith got the Chiefs from 2-14 to a place where, okay, now the quarterback's the problem. Is that a success? Because ultimately the guy that came after was better, and then they win a Super Bowl, Stafford with the Rams, obviously. And is that a success? Because I think a lot of people would look at Goff and say, like, Goff's the weird one, right? Like, because made a Super Bowl, but you had to bail almost completely right after his his second contract. And I think, like, a really good exercise, of course, like, for those who are GMs now, and, for those who are going to be GMs in the future, like, have that conversation. Like, what is the success step? Because I think, for example, if you look at the number one pick in this current draft, Stroud could be a top 12 quarterback in the league, right? And I think that that's a fair, but what if he never gets to a place where he can compete with some of those truly elite guys like Mahomes and Burrow and those guys, but you're constantly winning 9 games as the Panthers, a team that hasn't won 9 games in forever? Is that success, right? Versus Anthony Richardson, where, like, there's a lot of failure. But what if he does hit on everything that everybody says he could be? Like, pinning that down a priori is an incredibly good exercise.
It's a great exercise. And right now, someone's knocking at my back door here at the office for some reason.
Okay.
I think they're trying to grab the garbage. It's like one thing after another.
Hey, look, I'll freestyle again. I'll talk about the odds while you're gone. Go take care of it. Say hi to Peter Schrager on the way out on the TV. Okay.
It'll take me 20 seconds. Hang tight. Okay.
Okay. So we're gonna look a little bit at here where the market is on defensive line as we sort of progress here. This is Grinding the Mocks. Of course, Ben Robinson runs this fantastic website where he aggregates mock drafts. Some of the guys we're going to talk about today are here. So Will Anderson, projected pick, expected draft position, which is basically the average overall the mocks that Ben looks at, is 3.5. Jalen Carter of Georgia, despite his off-field problems, it's still about 5.8. Tyree Wilson at 7.1. Lukas Van Ness, Iowa at 14. And then it starts to drop off. Miles Murphy about 18. Nolan Smith about 18.5. Brian Breesy from Clemson, 26.3. And one of the last guys we're going to talk about today is Calijah Kancey at 26.6 from Pittsburgh, the Aaron Donald clone, if we're even allowed to say that about somebody. He's at 26.6. So this is where kind of we're at. We're going to talk about Anderson, Carter, Wilson, Van Ness, and Clancy today. And firstly, let's talk about Jalen Carter. I'm going to put up this graphic that I got this morning from FanDuel. Odds are subject to change, but here is where the market is for who is going to draft Jalen Carter. The Detroit Lions are at plus 270, as are the Chicago Bears. The Seahawks at plus 470. Eagles 6-1. Atlanta, the Falcons at 17-2, and the Raiders at 13 to 1. So Carter kind of in that top 10 range. Detroit's picking 6, Chicago's picking 9, Seattle's picking 5, Philadelphia's picking 10, Atlanta's picking 8. So they're he is a top 10 pick in the minds of the market. When I look at Jalen Carter, 6'3", 314, 33.5-inch arms, didn't work out at the combine, was not impressive at his pro day, but of course he was going through some things, or he put himself through some things off the field. He won at a rate of 25.4% on true pass rushing reps, which again are pass rushing reps where there's no play action, no screens, no rollouts, that kind of thing, where he's just trying to win, which is 14th in college football among defensive tackles last year. Thomas, when you watch him, what do you think?
Hi everyone, how you doing? We're live here, so yeah, I just want to let you know. Can I take another hour, or can I tell you? Can I look for you? Okay, I'll let you know. Yes, well, I will come out looking for you. Thank you so much.
So now everybody knows that the Sumer office is Sumer North. We have hygiene that is impeccable. So we're doing okay here. I thought you were laughing at my take on Carter, but then I started to see the cleaning people come in, and we got that there. So
I thought I addressed it already, but obviously I didn't communicate properly. But anyway.
I don't know. I think that's a little overrated. I think communication sometimes still it can't. You cannot account for some things sometimes. It's irreducible noise, as we call it in math.
Your question to me, however, as I flipped around, what do I think about Jalen Carter? Is that?
Yeah.
Oh, is that where you want me to lead in?
Yeah, let's talk about Jalen Carter first.
Look, obviously he's got a ton of ability. With what we know is so important in today's world, you need to pressure the quarterback up the middle, right? There's no question about it. We can talk about Kancey on another level, smaller guy, of course, but a guy like this who has the ability to get upfield, the guy that can rush up the middle, has the athleticism that is really, really dynamite for a guy. And I never use the word dynamite, but he has explosive athletic ability. He has body control, all the good stuff that you need to get around, to maneuver and to slice through to get to the quarterback. All of that is great. We don't need to go into a whole bunch of detail about the character side, although we should bring it up because you're going to ask me how much truly is the issue, and we can talk about that from a GM perspective. But when we talk about interior guys and we talk about the ability to get upfield, again, is this guy a first and second down guy? Is this guy, does he just hold the point? Is he a one gap guy, two gap guy? This guy has the ability to do it all. He is really, really special. He is right up there with some of the best ones that we've seen in quite a while. However, as you all have heard, he wasn't in good shape. He didn't really work out well at his workout. Of course, he didn't work out at the combine. So you're going to have people out there that are concerned about, what are they really dealing with, right? He's from Apopka, right? I think he's a Florida kid.
Yeah.
As far as the hood, the neighborhood. So I mean, he's obviously a dynamite athlete. I think his upside is really big. I think they need to figure out the depths of all of this, of course, but I don't know. For a while there, was he really projected to go in the top 5? Maybe. Where does he end up? How far down does he go? Again, like the kid a lot. Don't want to go in circles on this. It's going to be an interesting thing to see how far he does fall.
Yeah. Do you think so? When I watched him, I was certainly impressed. I did think, though, he was a guy that was more, he won with strength more than he won with speed. But that was, and does that translate in the NFL right away? I'm not sure. That would be something I'm concerned about. But, obviously with defensive linemen, if you can hold the point of attack, there's a lot of benefits to that, in the NFL as well. So that was when I watched him, look, I mean, his statistics are great. Winning 24.5% of the time is wonderful. So beyond the whole winning with speed versus winning with power kind of thing is one thing. But the other question I had is when the guy comes from as good of a program as Georgia, where, a lot like last year, people are like, oh, you have to kind of grade Trayvon Walker differently because he's asked to do this and Devin Lloyd's asked to do this, or not Devin Lloyd, I'm sorry. Quay Walker and Nakobe Dean are expected to do that. And then, et cetera, et cetera. they weren't they lost some players from 21 to 22. So he had to pick up some slack and did, but there are still just a ton of really talented players on that team. And so do you ever worry about the fact that maybe he's being helped out by players around him, or is that's obviously the scout's job to sort of tease out?
That is the scout's job to tease out. We would sit around in our conference room and we would go over those kind of ideas, and we would work through it. We would have whoever was in charge of really honing in on the D line, the 1 or 2 or 3 different people that were to really dig in that way. We didn't have all the intelligentsia like you working around there feeding them all that really interesting information, but it was an important part for us. So yes, you look at big programs like that and you wonder where they are. Part of the scouts' jobs, as I've mentioned before, is about projecting, especially the college scouts, to project to pro. There's no question about this guy is a man through and through. I'm not worried about his projection, from that standpoint. He's going to kick a lot of butt if he keeps everything in line, and if in fact, the issues that he might have that he can work through. But look, I think in the end, he's got the ability to be speed to power. I mean, he can get off the line and then jam it underneath someone's pads and collapse the pocket, which is a really important thing. If he sees the opening, he can also slice through. So again, I think it's a combination of all of the traits that you're looking for as an interior guy. I think they are what you're looking for. But again, if there's that wave of quarterbacks where a quarterback might not have gone because it was him, maybe there's a consideration that way in the top 7. And does he get into 8, 9, 10, and 11?
Yeah, I'd have a hard time seeing that just because I think the league is very into, like, I think the league likes the trench, right? Like, likes to draft the trenches high. And there's also there's rumors right now, and we don't have any inside info here. There's rumors right now that Houston might not take a quarterback. And so that kind of upsets the apple cart a little bit about who gets taken in that top 5. There's also, we talked about this on Monday with offensive linemen, but places like Seattle's like Pete Carroll has a culture where he's incorporated players who have had rough pass before. I think about Frank Clark and so that might be a good place. Detroit appears to be building something great, right? And one thing I like about Detroit, maybe you can they have a lot of former players on the staff, right? Aaron Glenn's a former player. Dan Campbell's a former player. Like all these guys that can relate to players of all shapes and sizes might be beneficial for a place like Detroit, and you imagine him with Aiden Hutchinson, that would be a pretty fierce defensive line for a team that's trying to win the NFC North for the first time in 3 decades. That's where I don't see him getting out of the top 10. And I think it really hinges on the next guy that we're going to talk about, which is Will Anderson. Will Anderson right now, if we want to look at the odds for the highest defensive player to be taken, Will Anderson is the overwhelming favorite, -350. So you have to, just for those who aren't used to betting, if you think Will Anderson's the first defensive player taken, you have to bet $350 to win 100. So it's a big risk if you want to bet that. Jalen Carter, who we just talked about, is 6-1 to be the first defensive player taken. Tyree Wilson, 6-1 as well. I think everybody after that is probably a little bit less of a gamble, a little bit less of a good gamble there. Will Anderson is a guy who, when he, 6'2", 253, so not a tall guy, ran a 4.6 in the 40, and to me, 32.2% win rate. He was, 6% stop rate in the run game. Like, to me, he reminds me a little bit of like that Kyle Van Noy, Josh Uche, like Belichick kind of Sam edge guy, that because I saw him play a lot of coverage when I looked at his film. I saw him obviously rush from depth at times. He's a smaller guy, but he's super effective. And so I think he's really got to go to a kind of a creative defense to get the best out of him. I think if you just line him up at outside linebacker every snap and just say, hey, play like a normal outside linebacker, he might not have the utility necessarily that other guys would.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about a guy with legitimate versatility. The Bill Belichick's of the world, of course, will love that. The idea of trying to decide whether in your system or a team system he's an outside backer, an OB, or whether he can rush. I mean, he definitely has natural rush skills. yeah, I understand that he's 4'6" or whatever he was, 4'6'2" or whatever his number was. When you watch him in the combine drills, I do, by the way, like watching combine drills. I know people think, it is my happy spot because it brings me back to so many years. And a little aside, when I used to work for the Detroit Lions and Ron Hughes was our personnel director, Kevin Colbert was our pro director, Rick Spielman was my senior that brought me in because I was the Blesto scout living down in the
Chris
Southeast.
Spielman was your middle linebacker.
Chris Spielman was the middle. Matt Russell, a dear friend of mine, who used to be the assistant GM for the Broncos. We had a really cool group there. We used to sit there and watch workout after workout after workout, like every combine workout, and we would grade them, right? So it's kind of ingrained in my mind. So when I get around here and I'm doing some prep work, I cannot finish my work without watching these guys' movement. And everyone remember, I know it's not, they're in shorts. I understand all that. It is truly about the movement, about the limitations of movement, right? So I joke about this. If you have a guy who's got one of his right foot is splayed out 5 or 8 degrees, you might not see it on the game vids, but you are seeing it when you watch the guy truly work out, and you're realizing that splayed foot might prevent him from slamming his foot into the ground, flipping at his hips a certain way if he's turning or redirecting. There are things like that are important because when they are in that spot on the field, there are limitations for them to make plays. I know it sounds really small. These are the nuances. I can't wait to sit down when you join us here in Atlanta and you move here and Sean Clement moves here and we get some guests here like Paul Saban, all of our group, and we sit here and we just bang out video and start watching these guys. You guys teach me analytics, and I can maybe teach you, hopefully, something from the nuance side of this. This is an important thing. So without getting off too much on a tangent here, the movement of this guy, I think, even though he's not a blazer, I think the ability to drop, the ability to turn the corner, the ability, because he is an athletic guy. I don't know if you heard that comment where they were quoting Nick Saban, who I think he was a 3-star recruit, right? I don't think he came out big time.
He wasn't a high guy.
And the first time that Nick saw him, he saw him lined up, put his hand down on the dirt to run. He saw him run. He said, "This guy's a first rounder." That's a pretty good story.
Yeah. Well, and I want to talk a little bit about your point about movement because both of us played college, like both of us were limited, right? You describe yourself as a slow defensive back. I describe myself as a bad tight end, but like when you are not limited athletically, but when your movement has limitations, there's only so much you can build on your game, right? Because if a coach is going to come over here and be like, "Hey, I need you to flip your hips a certain way," if you already have inefficiencies in your movement, it's going to be that much harder for you to adjust to a scheme or adjust to a different coaching style. If you have, like, I think about when I was a wide receiver before I was a tight end, it was like when they tried a different move off the line of scrimmage, I had false steps in my feet that were just really bad. And so I couldn't even execute the off the line of scrimmage stuff because my feet were so bad, right? And so again, when a guy can't move a certain way, or when his movement is limited, or it's not perfect, or it's not smooth, you're not development is harder, right? It's just harder to develop when you come from it's just like building a house on a bad foundation, right? If your house is on a bad foundation and you try to build a deck, it's just gonna be that much harder to build a deck. So and to me, I think that's a really that's why it's important to look at how they move.
Matchup league. It's about staying in phase. Remember, in phase, everyone in phases. For a secondary to be in phases, to be on someone's hip, your receiver and your DB staying together in phase. In my mind, I mean, whatever it is, making sure that you're able to match the person, in front of you. That could be an offensive lineman sliding with a D lineman. It could be, the coverage. It is just so important to make sure that can't be underestimated, because if you can't move, if you have restrictions, to your point, I don't care how fast you are. It's one of the reasons that we don't categorically say just because someone is a 4.3 and they jump really high that they are a very good athlete. They might have the athletic numbers. On defense, just so everyone knows, I'll throw this out. We always refer to it as reactionary athleticism, right? The ability to stop, start, the agility, the explosiveness, stick your foot in the ground, react. That was a big thing. That's a very different set of athletic tools than it is just flying or jumping. Do you remember a guy named Buck? You probably don't remember. Tabucky Jones.
Tabucky Jones, yeah, safety.
Yeah. He was a Syracuse guy, right? He was.
Well, he was a corner first, and you had to move him to safety because he wasn't
exactly
athletic enough to play corner. Yeah,
but linear guy, looked great. He had, no offense to him, but he had limitations, laterally, of course, and that was always the bane of his existence. How he was going to deal with that, and it was ours as a team. So it's just really, really important to know that just because guys have numbers does not mean they're going to just thrive in the NFL. Because if they can't move and they can't match it, man, they're left in the dust.
Yeah, and Belichick is so great at taking the guy like Devin McCourty is one of the best players in New England Patriots history, and he was a corner first. He couldn't play the man scheme anymore, so they moved him to safety. He's going to make the Hall of Fame. Like Tabucky Jones was part of Super Bowls for you guys, and like even though he wasn't a complete player and probably didn't live up to his draft position, he was still useful. But to your point, like he had to move to safety because there are only you have to be a certain movement guy to place corner in what Belichick tries to do for the most part. Here's a question here, and this is from BeatGamer99. We really appreciate all the people joining us live. I'm interested in Thomas's thoughts on Will Anderson, considering the talking point that he might not even be the best defensive player in the draft. Now, we've gone in order with Carter to Anderson here. I'm not trying to imply anything about how I think in terms of those two. If you had to compare these two and you had to list them on a big board, does it go Anderson first or does it go Carter first?
Character stuff aside, which is not usually me because I have to take in the whole picture, I think Carter gets the nod. I like Anderson a lot. They're just again, the fact that he's not blazing it at a 4.49 or a 4.50, that's a little bit of a concern to me, but believe me, he can thrive. I don't think it's drastic. I think he definitely warrants a top 5 pick, but as far as a top 1 or 2, that's pretty complicated when you're talking about someone who's just not smoking it as I might expect. I mean, what did Von Miller
watch me tee this up for you, Thomas? So this is the odds to be the 5th overall pick. So Will Anderson and Tyree Wilson are currently favored to be the 5th overall pick at about 2-1 each. Jalen Carter's at 7-2, and then after that, it's the 2 quarterbacks, Levis and Richardson, followed by Christian Gonzalez, the corner. We're going to talk about corners. But, like, to your point, Anderson's probably not going in the top 5. I mean, I think if a guy, like, and we're going to talk about this guy next, but and I thought let's transition to this. If a team like Houston at 2 is going to eschew the opportunity to go for quarterback, I think it's going to be for this guy here, Tyree Wilson. And I had a team staffer, a good friend of mine who was like, it's funny, every single week I always text him. I'm like, I'm watching this guy today on Saturdays. I love just like, and he goes, I'm watching 19 from Texas Tech. And I'm like, and I watch him, I'm like, oh, holy shit, this guy is a pretty big freak. Right. And so like, and that was the first one he told me this year, which was a lot of fun. And I'm like, okay, this guy's a top 10 pick. He's 6'6", 271 pounds, 35.5-inch arms, 23 reps in the bench press at the combine. He won at a rate of 37% in true pass sets, which is 6th in college football last year. Now, Big 12, caveats there. He was also 7th in college football. When he played on a run play, 10% of the time he stopped the run, basically behind the line of scrimmage. So productive, freak. Like, to me, if I'm picking top 2, I'm probably going to take a guy like that, even though I think right now Anderson's probably the better football player on average. I think Tyree Wilson might have the wider distribution, meaning his ceiling might be higher.
Yeah, he's a really interesting guy. Long, he is. You say freak. I mean, it's amazing to watch him. Right, as long as he is, how he gains ground. He's not the fastest guy off the mark. Normally this guy is not one that I'm. The makeup. I like the guys that have the little bit more bend to them and the ability to explode. That's something that I've always liked because I think it can be a difference maker. This guy grew on me as I watched him. Right, he's not firing off the ball, but he's gaining so much ground. And by the time he pulls those big old arms out there, I mean, it's amazing how much ground he's truly covering, but even when he's not moving. And while when I continue to watch him and I continue to see him improve, transfer from Texas A&M, right? I think he's
he went to Texas A. Yes, Texas A&M to Texas Tech. And by the way, if he goes in the top 10, I can't remember what the boundary is, but he's poised to become the highest drafted player to ever transfer at play. There's like I can't remember where I read this, but like he's unique in that he transferred one school to the next after playing at both schools. I know Burrow went to Ohio State, but he didn't really play. So he is a transfer player.
Well, and my point in the end is, look, you see him rushing off of either side. You see the range that he has. I still think he's on the come, as we say. He's a guy that has upside, of course. I still think he needs polishing. And, it depends on who's going to bring him in, which I've always said that is an important thing. Just like I maintain that the O-line coach is so important. If you don't have a good defensive line coach, man, you are lost. There are some great ones out there. There are some other ones that are just full of hot air. And quite honestly, you've seen them over the years, and they don't develop their guys. This cat needs to be developed to reach his potential. And I think he's going to have a really interesting, he's going to have an interesting journey about him. But I like him. I don't think he warrants that top, to your point. When I see him being listed in the top 3 or 4, I don't necessarily see that, respectfully speaking, excuse me. I'm thinking he's much more in that, 8 to 10, depending. It might even be a little bit beyond that. I know people are going to say, you never know. There's a really good group of D linemen, I think, in this draft. So we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, when I see him, I think, and this guy was a second-round pick by the Giants in 05 or 06. Justin Tuck comes to my mind, where I don't think Tuck wasn't a guy that got off the ball that fast, but he was an inside-outside player, which I think, to your point, like, we see defenses now where like the Packers aligned that what they did when he was there, Zadarius Smith and Preston Smith over the guards and create havoc. I think he might end up being that guy that muddies the center a little bit on some pass downs. I think he's got some of that because, and this is like this is a slight to him a little bit, because he just can't line up at one of the defensive end spots and win consistently every single down the way that the truly elite guys can. But I think he can be useful that way. To your point, though, if he doesn't develop into a guy that can win consistently every single down, he isn't worth the second pick, of course, because that's probably reserved for a guy who is like in the Von Miller, who was the second overall pick. That kind of player that's what that top pick is reserved for.
Well, these guys and these kind of guys, as you know, with this kind of physical these kind of physical attributes, excuse me. They have people on the edge of their seat, right? There's the what if he develops into what we can, what we thought, let me just dig back into the banks here. Calais Campbell, 12? What was he drafted? I can't.
Yeah, he was a top 10 pick so he was Arizona before he was Jacksonville, right? Yeah. And then,
But he was right around that area, and developed into some, obviously.
Weirdly though, right? He was a 3 tech at first and then came out and became a 5 and 7 tech. Like, it's kind of interesting, right? Like some of the great interior defenders kind of moved to edge as they got older. J.J. Watt being one, Calais Campbell being another. Like, and so maybe that's there, but I don't know. And we'll talk about Lukas Van Ness here in a second. I don't know if you could spend that high of a pick on a guy who, is Solomon Thomas like, right? Like in the sense of he's better. From a pass rusher standpoint, he's better on the interior, but size standpoint, he has to play edge. Like that's a hard sell. And that's why, of course, everybody likes Jalen Carter because he's big enough to play inside and, and the rundowns. And he's also athletic enough to rush the passer from the interior as well. And so that's why I think people like Carter the most among defenders in this draft.
We used to say this all the time. Years and years ago, especially when you first get in as a scout in the league, and maybe a lot of our listeners will feel this way. Like there's so much more at their fingertips now, right? And being able to watch these players and what it used to be if you weren't in the business. But you realize in that top 5, even 1 to 5, there are issues with every player, right? No one is perfect. No one's got everything going, in their direction. So you get a guy like this that he's a good football player, with definitely an upward trajectory. He'll continue to grow with the right coaching and development. But even if he doesn't rise up to be that elite player, the 8 or 9, the rare, which there's more than likely he won't, he can still be a good, between that good and very good area, or the very good football player, and make a lot of money and be in the league and make more than making money, help make a successful team.
Yeah.
Because he has some really good attributes. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be eye-catching besides his length. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, for sure. Now, let's jump to a defensive tackle now, because this is sort of the opposite of length. We're going to talk about Calijah Kancey, a defensive tackle from Pittsburgh. Now, everybody's going to think about Aaron Donald here because it's 6'1", 281, only 30.5-inch arms. So he's a small dude. And 4.67 at the combine. That's fast for a defensive tackle. He had a 27% win rate, which, that's better than Jalen Carter. That's basically, that's better than Jalen Carter was last year. Obviously, you have the ACC caveat versus the SEC, but this is a productive player who, when I watched him, I'm like, that's a disruptive player. Now, can he go in round one with the size that he has? Given the fact is like he's just undersized to be playing defensive tackle in the NFL.
Oh, I don't think there's a doubt that he could go in round one. Where that range is, 24 to 32, you never know. And you never know. Sometimes people get really excited about someone like that. They know how they're going to use them. Coming back to having, a really adept D-line coach is going to help. What is his upside? Look, we had an opportunity to be around a guy who's probably 20 pounds heavier. In Grady Jarrett, a guy that we picked in the 5th round, of course, he really rose to the occasion. We ended up, at the very end, almost $18 million a year. Good for him. The Aaron Donald comparison, yes. The ability for him to beat people off the line, to one gap like he does, because, I think it's amazing how quickly he can get through some of this stuff. Stay low, move around, bend around blocks, make special plays. Now, as we all know, he's going to get engulfed at times. And if some of these big old hosses get on him, it's not always easy to get away from it. But if you're strategic with them, and you're smart with how you're going to stunt and how you're going to put your games together, of course, I think it's, there's a chance for this guy to make a difference. It's funny because how do you truly project to Aaron Donald? It's a little bit complicated, but I think he's a very good football player, and I think there's a very good chance that he could go in that 25 up range and not get out of the first round.
Now, you having a great historical football mind will remember this player. I think of John Randall every time I think about guys like this, right? Like Randall was undersized. Like there's the you talk about great defensive line coaches. John Tierlink of the Vikings was the guy. You think about like Dolman, Randall, Henry Thomas was a 100-sack guy in his career. Keith Millard was a defensive player of the year. Like he coached, great defensive linemen, and none of those. Randall was an undrafted player out of Texas, like one of those directional Texas schools. And like he had to put a weight in his shorts to make the Vikings because they wouldn't let him play if he didn't weigh up over. And the great thing about those Vikings defenses were always like, hey, we're going to rush upfield, and if the running back runs by us, so be it. I think what you said was you have to be strategic about it. So when I think about Calijah Kancey, I think about a team like the Philadelphia Eagles, who they used a first-round pick on Jordan Davis last year. Big kid, right? That guy holds the point of attack. He can be your two-gapper. And then, a guy like Kancey can be sort of a different, a one-gapper and up-the-field guy that doesn't have to worry about the deficiencies. And this, again, when you think about defense as a weak link system, even first-round picks, I think, in the NFL now, you can't ask them to do everything. And I think if you're gonna get success with this player in your system, he's got to be a guy for whom you complement with the other players on your team.
Got to compliment him. Got to be creative. When you start talking about Randall, by the way, remember Texas A&I. You're exactly right. You said directional, and those guys, there were some really good athletes coming out of there. I remember I was up in the CFL. We had people that we were bringing through Texas A&I all the time because they were just, an inch short and a step slow, but they were really good football players. So a little bit of historical
Randall was,
perspective
by
there.
the way, another defensive tackle who was a 3-tech for most of his career. And then as he got older and maybe a little bit less willing to deal with the punishment play to end, later on, much like J.J. Watt, much like, guys like Calais Campbell. I like this prospect. I think, again, you're looking at a guy who can be very productive in the NFL, which is exactly what you're looking for in round one. This one's a little bit interesting. So let's finish off here with Lukas Van Ness from Iowa, 6'5", 272, 34-inch arms, passes all the tests size-wise. 4.58 in the 40, very good. 33.9% win rate in college football. But it's weird to me how he got there. So I'm watching his film, and I'm looking at his wins, and they're all from like the interior of the line. And I'm thinking to myself, if you're a guy, like it's sort of like wide receiver, which you talked about last week. If I need to put you in the slot for you to win in the NFL in college, what does that say about your NFL prospects? If you're an edge, and I got in the Big Ten, right, where we're not talking about the best athletes at tackle, if I got to put you inside for you to win in the Big Ten, I'm a little worried, right? That's kind of where I get the Solomon Thomas comp, where it's like, not necessarily big enough to play defensive tackle every down, not necessarily good enough maybe as a pass rusher to play edge every down. Is that, obviously we look at the grinding the mocks, he's projected to go right at pick 14 or so. That's a middle of the first round pick for a guy who might be a little limited.
Wow, yeah, a lot said there. Of course, I mean, I brought up a little earlier to you after I watched the combine workout on him. Was concerned. I think he's a good football player. Again, remember, I'm very particular about my verbiage and how I didn't say very good, or I didn't say bad. I think he's good in a lot of areas. I think he's good. Now, good doesn't always cut it. Good doesn't always justify, drafting at number 8 or 9, like where they're projecting the Falcons to take him. If they take him, there's going to be a reason for him, right? Probably because hardworking, all-American guy, works his butt off in a lot of ways. There's a lot of really positive elements. It comes from a school and a program and a coach that I mentioned in one of our last pods. I mean, I'm a huge, huge fan of what they do at Iowa. I think they do some really good stuff. Sometimes it's not always with, always the top level people. They've done a great job playing with those people. Kirk Ferentz is, I think, one of the best coaches, hands down, to be around this sport. So I think it's really good. They train him properly. There are elements to his movement. When you watch him, the ability to gather his weight and to break down and to turn the corner precisely. Again, the agility, the ability to redirect when you need to redirect. It's not pretty. There's a rounding element to getting around the corner as well. Or when he's trying to, again, jam his foot in the ground and try to go around to run people down, he can run straight ahead, right? We've seen that before. There are guys, I mean, it's a 4.58. Like, that's a damn good 40 for a big old dude covering some ground. But if you watch him, he's not the guy that's turning him over that fast. He's got big strides and he's covering ground. There's an upside there in the sense of he'll continue to grow a little bit. I'm not saying a huge upside. I just think this guy's going to be a solid, consistent performer. When I brought up a guy like Kerrigan, where is Kerrigan on that? I don't know. It feels like Kerrigan's forever. How long has he been out? I mean, he came out how many years ago?
He's been retired for maybe a year or two, but he was in the league for a dozen years, right? I mean, like that's, that's a, and when you said Falcons, I thought Patrick Kearney, right? Like kind of that kind of player where, not just to make the racial, comp, but like, very similar, like long levered guy who's not necessarily the most athletic. Well, not necessarily playing the most athletic. And like when you talked about like kind of the lack of bend, I want to say too, like, so George Karlaftis had a similar thing. Another Big Ten defensive end last year that the Chiefs drafted late in the first, had a 5 or 6 sacks. We obviously won a Super Bowl, but it had to be a complimentary end, right? Had to be the Tamba Hali to Justin Houston type player.
Right.
That's always what I worry about when you take an edge like this in the top half of the first round is like, is he a Derek Thomas or is he a Tamba Hali? Is he because I don't know if you can teach a defensive end to bend after a certain point. Like, I think, I think that there are some innate things that defensive ends can do that separate them from the truly like Von Miller, Derek Thomas, Bosa's, that kind of thing versus, the guys who are very good, Tamba Hali, who gets multiple sacks, but you never want him to be the top defensive end on your team.
So, and I know personally, I have to be careful about this when I start talking about fluidity of movement and smoothness to bend around the corner, to get low and do what they need to do. And it looks really pretty doing it. That's one thing. There are guys out there in the past who haven't really looked really good doing it, and they're productive and effective and efficient with it. To me, it's really, really important that you note that, and you're differentiating between, it's just not a pretty looking dude. This comes back probably to Kerrigan. Kerrigan played a long time in the league. He wasn't pretty turning the corner. He wasn't pretty when he had to start or, clear the mess. I mean, there's a lot of elements here that are really important, and I personally believe you need to be very clear with your scouting staff and your coaching staff of what you're expecting. Don't bring this guy in and draft him at 8, 9, 10, and 11, and then say, okay, he's just kind of situational. Before you know it, you're a GM staring down the barrel of a defensive end who is limited, and he's playing 35% of the time. I won't have that. That was my biggest pet peeve, when you have coaches falling in love with someone, and you as a general manager have to look at the owner and say, he's getting what, 32% play time? No. When you're talking there, yeah.
The only way that can happen is if it's Aldon Smith, right? Where he comes in on a defense that's already made, because Aldon didn't start a game as a rookie. They had Paris Haraldson and I believe Ahmad Brooks, but then eventually he's like, you have to get the 15 sacks then. If you're not going to start as like Mark Anderson was that way, and I think who is the guy? The Bears great cover 2 defenses. The Alex Brown, the Florida guy with the chop when he made the sacks. Those guys better get 10 sacks if they're going to be situational, and they better be starting in year 2.
That's right.
The guy's a top 12 pick.
This kid didn't start in 20. What did he not start in 20? Did he start in 21? I can't remember.
I don't think so. I think that this was year 1 of him getting significant stats. I'll make sure so we don't mislead our audience here, but it's a good point, and that is also something to worry about with some of these guys.
Yep. Good football player. Just keep it in perspective of what he's going to do for the team. And again, I hope, because look, I will always have a soft spot for the Falcons, of course, as counterintuitive that might seem to most people who think that I would be cheering against them. It's important that they put together this next string of drafts are going to be really, really important to grow.
Matt Ungachek is right. No, Van Ness has never started. In fact, Van Ness, so last year he had a career high 478 snaps. In 2021, 462 snaps. He's played less than 1,000 snaps in college. Now, he was, again, like I said, 33.9% pressure rate. That's good, right? But we also, and just a little bit of analytics for people, when volume goes up, efficiency goes down, right? So you do have to grade guys that don't play a lot on a curve. Same thing with running backs, right? It's the Tony Pollard, Zeke thing where everybody's like, Tony Pollard's averaging 5 yards a carry. It's like, yeah, because he gets half the carries. We have to be worried. You have to be concerned about that. If you can keep it over a high volume, that means you're elite.
Ask Matt Yu there while he's on his laptop or whatever. Can he please look up the amount of reps that he had? Because I swear he had 17 reps. That's pretty midline in a situation. He's a good looking guy. Don't get me wrong, but I thought he was a 17 rep guy. It wasn't like he was popping off the 20 pluses, right? So where is he?
Yeah, I'm on the NFL.com, NFL.com here. As a guy who topped out at 12 reps. He had 17 reps. 17. A short shuttle of 4.32, not as fast as Eric Eager in college. tough scene there for him. But
you guys never acknowledge the fact that we really didn't care that much about short shuttle. This all comes back to Bill Polian. Those of us who are really dialed in on movement and athleticism, it was all 3-cone. And by the way, who spent about 9 or 10 years at the 3-cone at the combine? I mean, that was me. When Mike Nolan joined us at the Falcons, I was at that point the general manager. He came in for an interview, I think it was a couple years later, and he's like, the 3-cone guy. That was truly how I was about ready to fire him right there and say, you're not being hired. I don't know how, anyhow, we hired him.
Mike Nolan, by the way, a couple notes before we leave. Niches get riches. So if you become the guy, that's okay, by the way. But also, Mike Nolan, most hilarious draft in 2005 because they took Alex Smith. I think they took Ahmad Brooks, if I'm not mistaken. And every single interview with Mike Nolan, he said, this is what I want. This guy is what I want the 49ers to look like. He said that about every single player. They interviewed him every single turn. And, of course, in hindsight, he probably would have liked Aaron Rodgers to be a player that the 49ers look like. But, alas, Alex Smith ended up being a good pro, but not as good as Rodgers, of course.
Mike, as you know, Mike he was a good football coach, comes from a very good family, and he kicked some butt for us when he was scheming with some of our guys. I remember Mike used to always say, not saying he wasn't interested in scouting, but he used to say to us, just bring in the players. We will put them in the right spot to be the right place. That's a good and that's a tough thing for a personnel man, right? Because you're like, and then after, and we've joked about it since then, but after, he would be on our local radio stations after he got fired and I was still hanging around. And he was like, we never got any good football players in there. We didn't have, and I used to think like, Mike, you said you could just let us bring in the players. Everything was fine. So, that's life in the NFL, right? A lot of fun.
By the way, Mike Nolan, and this turns all the way back to some news this week. As a football junkie, I have to say this. It's part of my religion. Mike Nolan is the head coach of the USFL's Michigan Panthers. They are opening this weekend. Their quarterback is Carson Strong, formerly of Nevada, with the guy whose knee injury, of course, failed him in the NFL. Michigan Panthers, as Tej Seth, one of our great data science extraordinaires, would say, the last Michigan pro football team to win a championship, with one of my friends, Bobby Hebert, throwing the ball to Anthony Carter in the 80s. So good times. We have 8 actually professional football games this weekend. Mike Nolan will be the head coach in one of them. It's the circle of life, Simba. So much fun.
We got one more on Mike Nolan. We might as well be Mike Nolan pro here. Remember what he was noted for?
He wore a suit on the sideline on a Thursday night.
Right. And his dad was a long time, obviously came from a football family. I always have a soft spot and a bond with those guys who have fathers in the business because, you grow up a certain way, whether you're a good coach or you become a personnel man or a GM, it's interesting. But Mike, Mike was that suit guy. He looked good. He wore it well too.
Yeah, it was sort of, I remember it funny. It was like, they made him this suit that had like Under Armour material. So it was still kind of athletic-y and stuff. I'm like, why can't we get those suits? Like, I gotta wear this cotton, thing to church every week. And like, instead he's balling out over there. But yeah, that was interesting time in 49ers football. You can't talk about the Jim Harbaugh Niners without talking a little bit about the players that Mike Nolan helped get them. So awesome. This has been fun. I love talking defensive linemen because I think the position is fairly straightforward, but there's so many cool nuances to it. And Thomas, it's been a pleasure, of course, to walk through the nuances with you. For all of you listening, again, we really appreciate it. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. Obviously, for those of you that are watching us on Twitch, we welcome you as well. Continue to do so. As I said in the last podcast, tell a friend about the show because if you do, once we hit it big, you can say that you were there first. So for Thomas Dimitrov, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 47 of the Sumer Sports Show.